Welcome to the second lecture on The Great Gatsby. In this lecture, we'll look at Nick's journey into the world of Gatsby and also how the events in New York change his understanding of the American dream. Nick's journey begins with Gatsby at the end of Chapter 1 when he sees Gatsby standing quietly and looking with longing across the water. Nick believes that Gatsby is looking at the green light at the end of Daisy's dock, perhaps in a state of thoughtful contemplation, yet Nick doesn't understand what Gatsby is actually doing. Gatsby's not looking at the green light itself, but rather the lit area because he knows that it leads up to the place where Daisy lives. Gatsby has purposefully bought a house across the water from her so that his parties might lure her over to his house so that she can see firsthand how he's transformed himself during the last 5 years. Nick has recently moved here too. He's likely rented the house in this location because it was close to Tom and Daisy, the only people in the area that he's known for many years. Nick doesn't talk to Gatsby on that night, but shortly thereafter he attends one of Gatsby's parties, again not realizing their larger purpose. At this party, Nick begins to see the larger idiosyncratic life of Jay Gatsby, and, like many others at the party, explores the possibility that some unusual motivation must have provoked Gatsby to host these weekly events open to anyone who might like to attend. Some there that night believe that Gatsby is merely trying to elevate his social image through these parties. Others believe that he's foolishly celebrating his new wealth. But most suspect that some unusual motivation rests beneath the surface of these regular gatherings.
With Jordan's slender golden arm resting in mine, we descended the steps and sauntered about the garden. A tray of cocktails floated at us through the twilight, and we sat down at a table with the 2 girls in yellow and 3 men, each one introduced to us as Mr. Mumble. "Do you come to these parties often?" inquired Jordan of the girl beside her. "The last one was the one I met you at," answered the girl, in an alert, confident voice. She turned to her companion. "Wasn't it for you, Lucille?" It was for Lucille, too. "I like to come," Lucille said. "I never care what I do, so I always have a good time. When I was here last, I tore my gown on a chair, and he asked me my name and address. Inside of a week, I got a package from Crorier's with a new evening gown in it." "Did you keep it?" asked Jordan. "Sure I did. I was going to wear it tonight, but it was too big in the bust and had to be altered. It was gas blue with lavender beads. $265. "There's something funny about a fellow that'll do a thing like that," said the other girl eagerly. "He doesn't want any trouble with anybody." "Who doesn't?" I inquired. "Gatsby. Somebody told me." The 2 girls and Jordan leaned together, confidentially. "Somebody told me they thought he killed a man once." A thrill passed over all of us. The 3 Mr. Mumbles bent forward and listened eagerly. "I don't think it's so much that," argued Lucille skeptically. "It's more that he was a German spy during the war." One of the men nodded in confirmation. "I heard that from a man who knew all about him, grew up with him in Germany," he assured us positively. "Oh no," said the first girl. "It couldn't be that, because he was in the American Army during the war." As our credulity switched back to her, she leaned forward with enthusiasm. "You look at him sometimes when he thinks nobody's looking at him. I'll bet he killed a man." She narrowed her eyes and shivered. Lucille shivered. We all turned and looked around for Gatsby.
That night, some of the most pointed skepticism comes from the owl-eyed man in Gatsby's library, who, though drunk, suspects that the entire room has been put together with scholarly books to arrange Gatsby's image as someone who is both well-connected and well-educated. The owl-eyed man points out that in these books, the pages haven't been cut. But what does that mean? In bookbinding in the 1920s, some books came with their pages uncut at the edge, just one continuous loop of paper. The first reader would then need to cut them open. Today we would say that a house like this was arranged like a movie set, where everything is positioned to create a convincing image. In 1922 in New York, however, the illusion is more accurately directed at the theatrical stage, where sets and props define images for the fictional lives that live there.
On a chance, we tried an important-looking door and walked into a high Gothic library paneled with carved English oak, and probably transported complete from some ruin overseas. A stout, middle-aged man with enormous owl-eyed spectacles was sitting somewhat drunk on the edge of a great table, staring with unsteady concentration at the shelves of books. As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. "What do you think?" he demanded impetuously. "About what?" He waved his hand towards the bookshelves. "About that. As a matter of fact, you needn't bother to ascertain. I ascertained. They're real." "The books?" He nodded. "Absolutely real. Have pages and everything. I thought they'd be a nice durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages and... Here, let me show you." Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcases and returned with Volume 1 of the Stoddard Lectures. "See?" he cried triumphantly. "It's a bona fide piece of printed matter. It fooled me. This fellow's a regular Belasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness, what realism. Knew when to stop, too. Didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect?" He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse.
In the chapter that follows, Chapter 4, Nick summarizes many weeks by telling us that he has spent a good deal of time learning the bond business. He also tells us that he has begun to date Jordan Baker. The main drama in this chapter, however, is focused on one July day when Gatsby takes Nick to lunch in New York. By this point, Gatsby understands that his parties aren't producing their intended effect. They aren't bringing Daisy over to his house. Gatsby doesn't fully grasp the underlying reasons, but based on his actions, he appears to sense that it has to do with a limited understanding of how people with lifelong wealth live. Instead of the parties, he develops a second plan, one in which his request will be carried forward by people who better understand how to present themselves in Daisy's social environment. As they drive, Gatsby tells Nick about himself, presenting a version of himself that will hopefully make him seem as though he is Daisy's equal in wealth and class. Nick is immediately skeptical of Gatsby's claims. At the beginning of the novel, during the character-centered introduction, Nick told us that he doesn't always understand how to read people who grew up in circumstances different than his own. He's also learned that certain ambitious young men who invent the details of their lives based on stories they read in magazines and books often confide in him their made-up conquests. The vast majority, he's discovered, are lying. But he always holds judgment in abeyance until he feels he has all of the evidence, because a few times in the past, a person who, with his fantastical tales, initially struck Nick as yet another liar, turned out to be one of those rare individuals who, despite the unusual stories, was telling the truth.
Sitting down behind many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I had talked with him perhaps 6 times in the past month and found to my disappointment that he had little to say. So my first impression that he was a person of some undefined consequence had gradually faded and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. "Look here, old sport," he broke out surprisingly. "What's your opinion of me, anyhow?" A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. "Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life," he interrupted. "I don't want you to get a wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear." So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversation in his halls. "I'll tell you God's truth." His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It is a family tradition." He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He hurried the phrase "educated at Oxford," or swallowed it, or choked on it as though it had bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces. And I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him, after all. "What part of the Middle West?" I inquired casually. "San Francisco." "I see. My family all died, and I came into a good deal of money." His voice was solemn, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. "After that, I lived like a young Raja in all the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that had happened to me long ago." With an effort, I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they evoked no image except that of a turbaned character, leaking sawdust at every pore as he pursued a tiger through the Bois de Boulogne.
And this is the section here where Gatsby deeply engages Nick's skepticism, where Nick believes that perhaps Gatsby has lifted these details from books and magazines to construct a personal narrative. At this point, too, Nick feels it's likely that he's in the presence of yet another of these liars.
"Then came the war, old sport. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die, but I seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted a commission as first lieutenant when it began. In the Argonne Forest, I took 2 machine-gun detachments so far forward that there was half a mile gap on either side of us where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns. And when the infantry came up at last, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of dead. I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration. Even Montenegro. Little Montenegro, down on the Adriatic Sea. Little Montenegro." He lifted up the words and nodded at them with his smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited its tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. He reached into his pocket, and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. "That's the one from Montenegro." To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. "Orderi di Danilo," ran the circular legend. "Montenegro. Nicholas Rex. Turn it. Major J. Gatsby," I read, "for valor extraordinary." Here's another thing I always carry, a souvenir of Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of half a dozen young men in blazers loafing in an archway through which were visible a host of spires. There was Gatsby, looking a little, not much, younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease, with their crimson lighted depths, the gnawings of his broken heart. "I'm going to make a big request of you today," he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. "So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there trying to forget the sad thing that happened to me." He hesitated. "You'll hear about it this afternoon."
So let's break this down a bit. At this point, Nick appears to be swayed by the metal and particularly the photo. Now, of course, with Photoshop, you can edit your image into any environment you like. With a few clicks of a mouse, you can create a realistic photo of you walking through the streets of Rome or standing on the moon. But in 1922, Photos represented a verifiable reality. Nick, of course, has spent time in Europe. He immediately recognizes Trinity Quad at Oxford. He also sees that the person pictured is Gatsby, somewhat younger. And this, for him, becomes evidence that Gatsby is one of those few people with fantastic stories who isn't a liar. Looking at the intellectual materials of this novel, the author F. Scott Fitzgerald wants to explore if a man from humble means, such as a farm boy with immigrant parents, can find success in New York. Today, the version of the American dream is more tempered. Most people want to own a house, find a good-paying job, and have freedom from financial concerns. But the American dream is almost always contextualized by the economic anxieties that exist in the world. The 21st century hasn't been, at least so far, a really smooth ride. And so, modest success seems to us like meaningful goals. But in Fitzgerald's time, the American dream was arranged as the ability for anyone with hard work to rise up in both wealth and class standing. This concept overall is central to how Americans think of themselves as unique among the world's people. It's an idea we embrace at a very young age. Likely, when you were young, your parents came into your room, placed their hands on your crib, and said, "When you grow up, you can be anything you want to be." Then they gave you a list of examples: a doctor, an engineer, an astronaut, even President of the United States. This idea, especially as it was likely repeated during your childhood, conveyed two important pieces of information. One, that America possessed a unique system in which there were few barriers for hardworking people to rise from humble beginnings to a position of high standing. And two, identity in America is deeply defined by a person's job. In that list of things that you can be when you grow up, there's never anything that's not a career. I've never heard parents say, "When you grow up, you can be anything you want to be." A really good friend, a person whose hobbies are focused on art, and so on. To be in this equation is to have an impressive job. And lastly, parents always place the burden of possible failure on you, because there's always a caveat at the end of this incantation. And what is that caveat? You can be anything you want if, and what's that if? If you work hard enough. This, essentially, is the American dream, which is an idea that we pass from generation to generation. It focuses people at a young age on career aspirations and often gives them high, perhaps unattainable goals. After all, how many of us will actually be President of the United States? An extremely low percentage as compared to the millions who had that option dangled before them when they were young. Fitzgerald wants to test two aspects of the dream. First, he wants to understand if, under ideal circumstances, someone with a poor background like Gatsby can significantly rise in terms of wealth and class standing. And second, under what conditions would this happen? Even at this point, the novel is already beginning to suggest that wealth, especially wealth acquired through illegal means, is easier to amass than class. At the end of this section, Gatsby appears to know that people can't deny that he has money. But does he really have class standing? Is he well connected, and has he been admitted into prestigious clubs and elite social circles? Gatsby seems to understand that his lack of class standing will take additional effort to conceal when he tells Nick that he didn't want to be seen as, quote, a Mr. Nobody from nowhere. At this point, Gatsby is going to hand Nick off to Jordan, who will officially make the request. And what is that request? Well, this is how dating works in junior high, as I recall. I like Kelly, but I don't want to tell Kelly that I like her. So can you have a party and invite me and Kelly so it'll appear that we just both happen to be there? This is more or less what Gatsby wants. For Nick to arrange an afternoon tea where he could perhaps, by chance, see Daisy again. But why doesn't he just ask Nick himself? It seems such a small request. Well, I think there's a number of reasons for this. First, Gatsby has already somehow misjudged the effectiveness of those elaborate parties. He's not seeing clearly into Daisy's world, but Nick and Jordan would better understand how to arrange an event and the request to Daisy as well, in such a way that Daisy would come. Second, though it's just a tea gathering, everyone involved understands that it might lead Daisy into an extramarital affair. Jordan is far better positioned than Gatsby to explain how unhappy Daisy is at the moment and that assisting in these plans wouldn't be immoral for Nick. And third, there's romantic power here. How long have Nick and Jordan been dating? Well, I think about a month or maybe a month and a half. And if you're dating a guy for a month and a half, you can make any request, no matter how elaborate, and likely not be turned down. For example, some Saturday at 3, you can say, "Hey, do you want to go out for dinner tonight? Down by the water? In San Francisco?" And the guy will say, "Let me get my keys." But after dating that same guy for a year and a half, you can make the most reasonable request and be immediately turned down. After spending all Saturday studying together, you can say, "Hey, the pizza place on the corner is about to close in 15 minutes. Do you want to go get a slice with me?" And you can be told, "No, I'm kind of busy. You go and get whatever you need." And in this, by dating Nick for a month or a month and a half, Jordan is in the exact right place to have a certain romantic power over Nick, which will also play into Gadsby's favor. At lunch, Gatsby introduces Nick to Meyer Wolfsheim, and though we don't know this yet, Wolfsheim is one of Gatsby's underworld business partners. He's a large man, hair protruding from his nose, human molars for cufflinks. At first, Wolfsheim thinks that Nick is there to conduct some underhanded business. Gatsby quickly corrects the situation, but not before Nick senses Gatsby's connection to the underworld. This is the first reliable clue that Gatsby is not exactly who he says he is. Jordan, once alone with Nick, explains more of Gatsby's life, at least inasmuch as it concerns Daisy. And in this, we start to see new concepts of psychology being layered into this novel. No one person fully knows Gatsby, and to have an understanding of the past experiences that now frame Gatsby's current motivation, Nick needs to talk to many other characters, including Jordan, Daisy, Wolfsheim, and later Mr. Gats. In this, Nick works somewhat like a journalist, collecting up information and then relating it to readers, because in the 1920s, when this novel is written, the issue of knowing a character, of knowing a person, was a far more complicated process inside a novel than it was in the late 1800s. At this point, Nick essentially relates what he learns from Jordan so that we as readers can draw our own conclusions. Here we learn that 5 years ago, Daisy fell in love with a man named J. Gatsby, a young soldier who was about to be sent overseas. It is implied, though, that Daisy was unable to marry this man because her parents disapproved. He was poor and socially beneath them. Many months later, after Gatsby went to war, Daisy began to date other people and finally, the following summer, married Tom Buchanan. On the night before their wedding, Daisy got drunk and tried to call off the marriage. While on their extended honeymoon, right down there in Santa Barbara, California, Daisy learned that Tom had been having an affair with a hotel chambermaid, the one with whom he has the car accident. Sometime after that, they moved to East Egg, where Jordan met up with them again. After this meeting at lunch, Nick understood something unique about Gatsby, that he was not one of the cruel, aimless rich. He had an exact purpose, unified toward romance. His appearance, his wealth, even his parties were arranged so that he might have Daisy again. In this, Gatsby is set in sharp relief against the novel's other striver, Myrtle Wilson. Myrtle wants a better life for the material things and convenient services it will provide her, such as a dog, her own apartment and parties, and a masseuse to work out the tension in her neck. The goods and services for her are an end in themselves. She wants comfort and luxury. But for Gatsby, the goods and services are transitory. They are a means to finding non-material experience, specifically love. Gatsby seems mostly uninterested in his lavish mansion. For example, how many times does he himself use the pool? I think only once. These things are there so that he might find love again with Daisy. Nick now understands his proposed role in all of this: to provide an opportunity for Daisy to experience happiness beyond Tom, that big hulking brute of a man, and to allow Gatsby the opportunity to see if all of his work can finally be traded in for the relationship he once lost. As this chapter closes, we see one of the major plots on which this novel will oddly function: an unusual love triangle. Sometime in the not-too-distant future, Daisy will be torn between Gatsby and Tom, two men who offer her very different things. One offers a genuineness of affection, and the other secures her place at the top of American society. But those moments we will explore in our next lecture.